Good morning, class. I am Attorney Rex Angeles, and today I will be discussing Republic Act 10173, or more commonly and more famously known as the Data Privacy Act of 2012. Okay. The slides that I would be presenting herein are just notes, so you really have to listen in, because I will be presenting the substance as I go on to the respective slides. So what is Data Privacy Act of 2012? We really can consider the DPA, Data Privacy Act or DPA of 2012 as a 21st century law in order to address 20th century concerns. Okay? As we all know, our world as a whole, we are now experiencing the digital age or the information age. And because we are now in this kind of age, data, data is really a commodity, a valuable commodity which must be protected. Otherwise, it can create a public chaos or turmoil. Okay? The DPA of 2012 attempts somehow to catch up, to cope with the technological advancements that we are experiencing as a nation. Otherwise, our laws would now become impractical and irrelevant, and we do not want that. Okay. Data Privacy Act of 2012, okay, it protects the privacy of individuals while ensuring free flow of information to promote innovation and growth. Okay? This is what we call the twofold mandate of the DPA. Kung makikita po ninyo dito, based dun sa sinabi ko, the DPA tries to balance two vested interests, two valid interests. First, the interest of the privacy of individuals. So when we speak of individuals, we pertain to natural persons, not juridical persons, because juridical persons they are just mere fictions of law. They are mere creations of law. And we do not use the term individual to refer to corporations or partnerships or cooperatives. We don't use individuals, the term individual. So that is why when we speak of privacy of individuals, we pertain to privacy of the natural persons. So that's the first interest that is, uh, the state tries to balance. And the next interest is to ensure, to protect free flow of information in order to promote innovation and growth. So our state naman recognizes that certain information must be made available, must be disseminated in order for us as a country to promote innovation and growth para makapag-innovate ang bansa natin and for us to grow. Okay? So, that is what we call the twofold mandate. Very important, very important. Pwedeng lumabas yan sa quizzes nyo or finals. Next, the Data Privacy Act regulates the collection, recording, organization, storage, updating or modification, retrieval, consultation, use, consolidation, blocking, erasure, or destruction of personal data. Or sa madaling sabi, it regulates the processing of personal information. Okay, so lahat ng binanggit kong yun, yung mga collection, recording, etc., etc., You can sum it up into one term: processing. Okay? Processing of personal data or personal information. Third, the enactment of the DPA ensures that the Philippines complies with international standards set for data protection through our National Privacy Commission. So, National Privacy Commission, we can use the term NPC or commission. So, that pertains to the National Privacy Commission. Yet, if you will really read the law and its implementing rules and regulations, you would notice that the commission was only constituted in March of 2016. So kung mapapansin nyo, the DPA was enacted in 2012, and yet the National Privacy Commission was only constituted in March of 2016. So it took them almost 4 years to constitute the National Privacy Commission. So I am not sure what happened therein. Maybe sa budget, sa organizational structure, I am not really sure. But because of the long period of time bago na-constitute yung NPC, the implementing rules and regulations was only enacted and put into effect in 2016. So, in 2016 then, more specifically, September 9 of 2016. So, the law was passed in 2012, and yet the implementing rules and regulations was only enacted and promulgated in September of 2016, o 4 years. That is why, kung mapapansin po ninyo, medyo late na na-implement yung Data Privacy Act of 2012. Why? Because the IRR is delayed. And the IRR is delayed because the NPC, which is tasked to draft and promulgate the IRR, was likewise late na na-constitute. So, that's the effect therein. And, in fact, doon nga sa law, ang sabi is that after the effectivity of the DPA, the law, okay, the IRR must be put into effect, okay, after 90 days. Okay, after 90 days after the effectivity of the DPA. So, 3 months lang. Okay, dapat meron ng IRR. And yet, hindi ho nasunod yon. Nangyari is that it was only after 4 years after the IRR was enacted. So, kaya medyo, although the law is a bit old, 8 years, yung implementation, medyo bago-bago lang. Okay. So, that is Republic Act 10173. Brief introduction with respect to the said law. So, we go to the next slide. Next, what is Data Privacy Act? Ayun na, as I've discussed before sa unang slide. Now, in full title ng Data Privacy Act is, it is an act protecting individual personal information in information and communication systems in the government and the private sector, creating for this purpose the NPC and for other purposes. Okay, the DPA aims to protect the fundamental human right privacy of communication while ensuring free flow of information to promote innovation and growth. Yung last part na yan, discuss ko na yan, that's the twofold mandate. Now, we go back to the title. Pansin nyo rito, maraming definition of terms. First, individual. So, pag sinabi nating individual, as kanina, this pertains to natural persons. But under the DPA, there's a specific term for individuals, and that is data subjects. Data subjects. So, because of that, data subjects, this only pertains to natural persons. Next, Personal information. Okay? Personal information. So, what is personal information? So, magsasanga-sanga pa yan. So, personal information, then we have sensitive personal information. Then, we have privilege information. And thereafter, we have to differentiate it with contact information. So, mamaya, we will be defining all of those terms. Next, information and communication systems. So, ano-ano ba yan? Ano ba yung information communication systems? Medyo technical na yung definition yan. Well, because we are in the technological information age or digital era nga, kamo. And in the government and the private sector. So, magandang na-add tong private sector na to. Kasi itong government, we have some protection under the Bill of Rights. Okay? Under the Bill of Rights, uh, those are government, those are civilian protections rather. Those are civilian protections against government attacks or intrusions. So somehow, may konting protection na tayo under the Bill of Rights and Article 3 thereof. Pero mas maganda nung nadagdagan yung private sector. So, this is a added welcome development for the added protection of data subjects. So those are the definition, konting definition of terms yun. Uh, Next, I'll discuss the structure of the Data Privacy Act, yung overview of the sections. So sections 1 to 6, definitions and general provisions. Section 7 to 10, the Office of the or the NPC, the National Privacy Commission, mga qualifications, mga functions nila, mga obligations of the commissioner and yung mga deputy commissioners, etc. Sections 11 to 21, it discusses, ito, napakahalaga, rights of data subjects. So, rights of data subjects and obligations of personal information controllers and processors. Okay? So, yan, pag sinabi kong personal information, magkaiba po yan, personal information controller at personal information processors. Pag sinabi kong PIC, that's personal information controller. Pag sinabi ko pong PIP, that's personal information processor. Pag sinabi ko pong PI, that's personal information. Don't get me wrong, ha? Okay. Sections 22 to 24, provisions specific to government. As I've discussed before, applicable sa government. Sections 25 to 37, penalties. So dito sa penalties na to, this not this does not only include payment of fines, hefty fines, matataas na mga penalties dito. But it likewise include imprisonment. So somehow this DPA has a criminal law element to it because you cannot have a person imprisoned without a criminal law punishing it. That's a very basic principle of law dito sa Pilipinas. So may criminal law element sa DPA. And sections 38 to 45, the miscellaneous provisions. And nakalagay din doon yung effectivity clause. Effectivity clause. Okay. So we go to the next slide. Now, the twofold mandate, na-discuss ko na to kanina, it is under Section 2 of the Data Privacy Act. Okay, so what is right to privacy? Right to privacy. Under a certain U.S. Justice Louis Brandeis, I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, Brandeis siguro. He called it the right to be left alone. the right to be left alone. Okay. So right to privacy refers to the concept that one's personal information or personal data is protected from public scrutiny. Okay? In fact, under Article 12 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, of which the Philippines is a signatory, okay? It states therein, and I quote, "No one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home, or correspondence, nor to attacks upon his honor and reputation. Everyone has the right to the protection of the law against such interference or attacks." Ganda nun. That's why the DPA was enacted somehow in furtherance of this Declaration of Human Rights. No. The right to the protection of the law, the DPA, against such interference or attacks. Okay. Pwede rin natin maipasok dito yung sa Bill of Rights nga, as na-discuss ko kanina. But basically, this is just protection against government intrusion. So, under Section 2, Article 3 of the Bill of Rights of the 1987 Constitution, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures of whatever nature and for any purpose shall be inviolable. So, yun. The right of the person to be secure, to be protected, okay, against unreasonable searches and seizures. So, yeah. Basically, this is a protection afforded to civilians against government or the state. And Section 3, dito, the privacy of communication and correspondence shall be inviolable. So basically, against ano nga talaga to? Against the state, okay? Except under the exceptions provided in the Constitution. Under the NPC website, in fact, you can go to the NPC website in order to further your studies or information gathering with respect to data privacy. It stated therein the right to privacy is the right of an individual not to have private information about himself disclosed and to live freely from surveillance and intrusion. Okay. So, unless of course may consent nung data subject na yon or individual na yon, or unless it is covered under the exceptions provided by law. Okay. Now, we have to differentiate the right to information with right to privacy. So, na-discuss ko na yung right to privacy. So, what is right to information? So, dito papasok yung FOI law, yung Freedom of Information Law. 'Di ba? It is the fundamental right for any person to access information held by government bodies. So, dito papasok talaga yung right ng isang Filipino citizen to inquire about government or state transactions as long as hindi siya confidential or of public interest na kailangan confidential siya or matters of national security, di ba? So, basically, this right to information, mas madalas siyang available with respect to uh, disbursements of taxpayers' money. Kasi, syempre, ikaw, kinakaltasan ka buwan-buwan, lalo na kung ikaw ay sumasahod. Lamang, pagdating ng sahod mo, wala na po yung tax. Kaltas na. Mm. And your employer will be the one remitting the same to the Bureau of Internal Revenue. So, ang natatanggap mo na dyan, net pay, net of taxes. So, you really have a right to inquire about the disbursements, how taxpayers' money, including yours, okay, are spent by government bodies. So that's the right to information. So you have to differentiate that. But basically here, we're talking about more on the data privacy, right to privacy. Okay, next slide. Okay, next, DPA actors. Class, inoff ko muna yung camera ko since nakaharang kasi siya sa slide. Okay, so DPA actors, these are the different entities who have their pertinent or respective functions in a DPA environment or DPA setting. So first, the National Privacy Commission or the NPC, a independent body mandated to implement the provisions of the DPA and its implementing rules and regulations. So the DPA and its IRR. Next, data subject. It is an individual, okay, so natural person whose personal information is processed. So in the next slide, I'll be discussing what personal information is and what processing means. Okay, so that is data subject. So sa ngayon pa lang, talagang tandaan nyo na that what is really crucial here is personal information processing. So, okay, so personal information processing, whether data subject, whether PIC or PIP, ang functions nila nagre-revolve lang with respect to processing of personal information. Okay. Next, we go to the PIC or the Personal Information Controller. Okay, so mapapansin nyo dito, okay, it can be, or he can be a natural person, or it can be a juridical person, or any other body who controls, so that's the keyword, who controls the processing, okay, of personal information. So he can, a PIC can be a natural person, juridical person, or any other body who controls, okay? The keyword there is control. Control what? The processing of personal information. So data subject, personal information niya yung na-process. PIC, siya yung may control sa pag-process ng personal information ni data subject. Okay? And next, PIP or the personal information processor. Personal information processor. Same here, can be a natural or juridical person or any other body. Ang catch lang dito is that to whom the PIC may outsource or instruct. Ina-outsource lang ni PIC papunta kay PIP yung pag-control, okay, nung personal or nung pag-process nung personal information. So basically, PIC and PIP have the same functions, okay, processing personal information of data subjects, pero si PIC, okay, siya yung may control at si PIP, siya merely lang yung napag-outsourcean in order to process personal information. So talagang babagsak at babagsak kayo sa pag-process ng personal information. So hopefully everything is clear. Okay. Ah, yan, burahin lang natin para magandang tignan. Okay. So that's the DPA actors. So ngayon, let's go back to personal information controller and let's focus on the word control. Diba? Paano mo masasabi na ang isang entity ay may control over the processing of personal information. So ang sabi ng IRR is that there is control if the natural or juridical person or any other body decides on what information is collected or the purpose or extent of its processing. So you are the controller if you have the capacity, you have the ability to decide what personal information to collect from data subjects or the purpose or extent of its processing. So, yan. So, best example, pag kayo ay nag apply ng credit card, di ba? May mga information kayong nilalagay doon with pinapa-fill out sa inyo ng isang credit card company representative. Okay, you put there in your name, put there in your address, your gender, okay, your age, your birthday, ano pa ba? Address mo. Hmm. Minsan hinihingi pa yung TIN, work mo, 'di ba? Those are personal information na nakuha sa potential credit card holder who is a data subject. Okay? And the PIC therein would be the credit card company. Okay? Because he has the control on what information is collected. Usually, yung form na yon, ano na yon, template na yon. So, and sinong gumawa ng template na yon? Of course, the credit card company. And for the purpose or extent of its processing. So, nilalagay doon kung yung credit card company because pwedeng malaman kung ano yung work mo. Okay? So, pwede nilang i-verify kung talagang nag-work ka nga doon. Ilang years ka na doon. Magkano yung salary mo in order to assess yung ano mo, credit standing or yung capacity mo to be able to pay them back in case na gagamitin mo yung credit card nila. Okay. Then, the personal information processor, pwedeng i-delegate yon ng credit card company sa isang third party for them to process the credit standing of the credit card applicant. So that is control. So we go now to the next slide. Okay. Ito yung personal information. We've been discussing processing of personal information. So first, let us define what is personal information. So personal information refers to any information whether recorded in a material form or not. Okay, whether recorded in a material form or not. So pwedeng verbal information. May alam ka about a certain person. Oh, that can be personal information. So it can be in writing or it can be in digital document, okay? Or it can be orally then. Okay. The identity of an individual is apparent. Okay? Refers to any information from which the identity of an individual is apparent. So obvious na siya yung taong tinutukoy mo. Okay, pag sinabi mong Vilma Santos, oh, at si Tito B na artista, oh, o kaya si Ate Shawi, pag sinabi mong Ate Shawi, o Sharon Cuneta, di ba? Although ginagamit lang nila yung mga screen name nila at hindi yung mismong real name nila as appearing in their respective birth certificates, kilalang kilala mo na yung yun yung taong yun. O kaya nilagay mo yung picture ni President Duterte. Okay. So even if walang pangalan ni President Rodrigo Roa Duterte therein, okay, just by looking at the picture, you already know that it is really the our current president. Or next, B, can be reasonably and directly ascertained by the entity holding the information. So madaling malaman based sa perspective na kung sino yung naghahawak ng information na yun. Not necessarily by the public, but by the person who holds that information. So, for example, ako na lang, 'di ba? Pagka sinabi na, for example, meron akong student na pangalang Juan de la Cruz. Okay, at nag-post ako sa Facebook na Juan de la Cruz, you failed my subject. Okay, under CA 51025, 'di ba? So, all those in public perception, Juan de la Cruz, pwedeng hindi nila kilala 'yon, but because ako yung professor, okay? I have that information of the personal information of a certain Juan de la Cruz as my student. So, madali ko ma-identify na yung Juan de la Cruz na yon pertains really to my student. So, that is letter B can be reasonably and directly ascertained by the entity holding the information. And thirdly, when put together with other information, would directly and certainly identify an individual. So, for example, Juan de la Cruz, dahil maraming Juan de la Cruz dito, pero nilagyan mo na ng birthday niya, nilagyan mo na kung saan siya nagtatrabaho, nilagay mo na yung plate number ng sasakyan niya, nilagay mo na yung TIN number niya or TIN ID niya, 'di ba? So that is personal information still. So when put together with other information, madali mo nang malaman. Si Juan de la Cruz pa lang 'yon, yung tinutukoy na 'yon, the certain person na Juan de la Cruz. So that is personal information. So you just really memorize this, and know the concept by heart. Next, processing. Processing. So, mahaba-haba yung definition yan. Mahaba-haba yung definition ng processing, but it refers to any operation or set of operations performed upon personal data or personal information, including but not limited to o yan na lang. Collection, recording, organization, storage, modification, retrieval, consultation, use, consolidation, blocking, erasure, or destruction of data. So all operations, all activities that can be done with respect to personal information of data subjects that is covered under the umbrella term processing. So that is personal information and that is processing. Next slide. Next, we'll be discussing sensitive personal information. So what is sensitive personal information? So instead of defining it, ang ginawa ng DPA is that nag-enumerate siya ng mga kinds of sensitive personal information. So, itong SPI is a kind of personal information. So, isa to sa mga protected informations. So, ang nilagay dyan, the race, o yung ethnic origin, marital status, age, color, religious, philosophical, or political affiliations, health, education, genetic or sexual life. Okay? Proceeding for any offense committed or alleged to have been committed by an individual. Okay, government issued IDs such as SSS, GSIS, PhilHealth, Pag-ibig, yung sa LTO mo, driver's license, including previous or current health records and tax returns. So those are sensitive personal information. And those established by an executive order or an act of Congress to be kept classified. So that is personal, sensitive personal information. So maganda dyan, you memorize all of them. O iilan lang naman yan eh. Iilan lang uh, naman yan. At may mga idinagdag pa yung IRR natin uh, including, take note, bank and credit or debit card numbers. Okay? SPI yan. Websites visited. Materials downloaded. Yung mga dinownload mo. Oh, those are sensitive personal information. Okay. Any other information reflecting preferences and behaviors of an individual. Okay. Grievance information. Discipline information. Okay? Leave of absence reason. Bakit ka nag-leave of absence? Yung reason doon, that is a sensitive personal information. Hindi mo pwedeng basta-basta i-disclose yan without the consent of the data subject. And licenses or its denials, suspension or revocation. So, hindi ka pwedeng magsabi dyan sa Facebook kung hindi naman ikaw yung na-revoke yung license mo or na-suspend. So, that is sensitive personal information. So, take note of the list at yung mga dinagdag ko as provided for under the implementing rules and regulation. Next, we go to privilege information. Okay, and contact information. So, privilege information, basically itong mga nasa list na to, they are found under the rules of court. Okay, rules of court. So, pagka nag-law school kayo, maintindihan nyo yung rules of court. Okay, so, but for now, that would suffice. Okay, so husband or wife. Okay, cannot testify against one another without consent on any communication received by either in confidence. So, yan, hindi kayo pwedeng mag-testify sa korte against sa husband mo or sa wife mo with respect to any communication na shiner ng asawa mo sa iyo because you are married to each other. So, yan. That's privilege information. Next, attorney-client relationship. Yan. Hmm. Attorney-client relationship. So kami, yung mga kliyente namin, we cannot disclose their personal information. So hindi namin pwedeng sabihin kung ano-ano yung mga kasong pinagdadaanan nila to any other person o without their consent. Okay. So next, physician-patient relationship. Physician-patient relationship. So yung doktor naman at pasyente. Oh, that is privileged information. So yung medical history, medical records niyan, you cannot disclose that. Especially if it would blacken the reputation of the patient. So hindi mo pwedeng sabihin si ganto may cancer, ganyan, si ganto may AIDS, 'di ba? Kahit nga almoranas niyan, hindi mo pwedeng sabihin. Siyempre, masisira siya. Ma, mapapahiya siya, 'di ba? That is a privilege information. Okay. Next, minister or priest or to penitent making the confession. Oh, person making the confession. So, every time na pupunta ka ng confession room, magko-confess ka kay father, si father, of course, cannot divulge ano-ano ba yung mga kasalanan mo. Oh, na cheating ka. Hindi niya pwede yun. Tapos ire-report ka sa dean. Oh, hindi po pwede yun. That is covered by privileged information. Public officer given information in official confidence. So take note here, privilege information to, this is a protected uh, protected information, but in a limited capacity. Bakit? Because certain persons who are not covered by this relationship, of course, they can divulge those information. So, kunyari, attorney-client relationship. Oh, ang bawal mag-share si attorney. Okay? Pero si client, paano kung shinare niya, "Oh, si gan'to, siya ring abogado ko para dun sa kaso kong, kriminal." Si client yung nag-share doon sa kaibigan niya. Oh, is there violation of the privilege information? None, because it was the client who shared that information. Same with physician-patient relationship, minister, priest, or penitent, and doon sa nagbigay ng information doon sa public officer. So, doon sa husband and wife naman, so they are protected both ways. So, ang problem lang kung ang nag-share, what if kunwari yung anak niya, 'di ba? Mm. Or yung kaibigan niya, si kumpare, ang nag-share. Oh, that is not covered by the uh, husband or wife privilege information. Next, contact information. So, itong contact information na to, this is a contact information not covered by the DPA. Why? Because kung itong contact information, this must pertain to information of an individual with respect to his business. Okay? So kung ikaw syempre kung ikaw ay may business, of course, you have to divulge some information so that people can contact you. So mas madalas 'yan pagka mga suppliers, pagka may mga customers ka, you have to divulge certain information. But take note ha, ito information to enable an individual at a place of business. Kaya yan, mahalaga yan. At a place of business to be contacted. So this contact information must be for a business purpose. So since this is for a business purpose, it necessarily follows na certain information will have to be divulged. Includes the includes the names, position, name or title, business, telephone number. Pre, paano ka makokontak kung hindi ka mag-share ng telephone number mo? Business address, business email, business fax number. So take note ha, puro business yan. Must be related for a business purpose. So, ang sabi diyan, this is the kind of information that appears on a business card. Yung card na nga yan, may business pa rin. So that is contact information. So, and this is not really covered by the DPA. Okay. So usually, ang inalagay mo lang naman talaga diyan, yung mga para makontak ka. So there is no need to put there in your age. No need to put there in your gender. Of course, madali namang malaman sa name yung gender mo. 'di ba? So no need to put there in your TIN or your SSS number, 'di ba? So that is with respect to contact information. So we've discussed different kinds of personal information, ha? So you must remember those again. So personal information, then uh, sensitive personal information, privilege information based on the rules of court, and contact information. So now we go to the next slide. So this is the privacy ecosystem. So ano lang, may illustration lang dyan. Individual, the data subject, the regulator, and the company or agency who processes personal information. So we have the PIC and the PIP. So, wala. Madaling-madali lang naman yan, class. So, next slide. Next, we have the scope of application. Okay. This act applies to the processing processing of all types of personal information. Balik na naman tayo sa pag-process ng personal information. Processing of personal information. Okay. To any natural, okay, natural and juridical person involved in personal information processing, ayun, including the PIC and the PIP, who, although not found or established in the Philippines, use equipment that are located in the Philippines or those who maintain an office, branch, or agency in the Philippines. So, magandang example dyan, yung mga uh, credit card companies na kung saan yung main business nila or yung head office nila is located sa ibang bansa in foreign jurisdictions, but they have an office, branch, or agency here in the Philippines, or they use equipment that are located here in the Philippines. So pasok sila sa application ng batas na to. So this is under section 4 of the DPA. Next slide. So next, the extraterritorial application of the DPA. So ibig sabihin, the DPA provisions and its implementing rules and regulations likewise applies outside the territorial jurisdiction of the Philippines. So when shall this extraterritorial application be applicable? Okay. This act applies to an act done or practice engaged in and outside of the Philippines by an entity if, first, okay, the act, practice, or processing of personal information pertains to a Filipino citizen or a Philippine resident. Okay? Basta Pinoy, okay, extraterritorial application shall apply. Okay? Basta personal information ng Pinoy, whether the processing was made outside of the Philippines or made outside of the Philippines, DPA shall apply. Next, okay, the entity has a link with the Philippines. Link. Ano ba yung link na yan? Okay, ito yung tatlong yon. 1, 2, 3. So, if any of these, okay, are present, that's considered a link. Okay, a contract is entered in the Philippines, a juridical entity unincorporated in the Philippines. Ibig sabihin na incorporate siya sa ibang bansa but has central management and control in the country. Okay, but has central management control in the country, or the entity has a branch, agency, office, or subsidiary in the Philippines, and the parent or affiliate of the Philippine entity has access to personal information. So yan na, the entity has a link. Ano yung link na yon? Yung tatlong yan. And, okay, and the entity is processing personal information in the Philippines. Okay, has a link in the Philippines, yung tatlong yan. And first, the entity is processing personal information in the Philippines. So regardless kung anong pinaprocess niya, whether pertaining to Filipino citizens or to foreigners, as long as the processing of the personal information is located here in the Philippines, or take note, or even if the processing is outside the Philippines, okay, as long as it is about Philippine citizens or residents. So, babalik ka na naman dito sa number 1. Yan. So, yan lang yan. So, hopefully, naintindihan nyo. Second, the entity has a link with the Philippines. The first three, a contract is entered here in the Philippines. Dito nagkaroon ng kontrata. Or second, a juridical entity incorporated abroad but has central management and control here in the Philippines. Or third, an entity that has a branch or agency or subsidiary located here in the Philippines and the affiliate or the parent company abroad has access to the personal information here in the Philippines. So extraterritorial application, they are still covered by the DPA provisions and the IRR. And the third one, okay, the entity has other links. So other links. Okay, other links, pinaghiwalay pa. May link na rito, may other links pa rito. So such as but not limited to. Ito, the entity carries on business in the Philippines. Okay, may business siya sa Philippines and the personal information was collected, held by an entity in the Philippines. So yan. So pag yung mas maganda you memorize this by heart, okay? And at the same time get the rationale for the extraterritorial application. So somehow, kung mapapansin nyo, dapat merong established link. Okay? Dapat merong somehow related sa Pilipinas. So, pag sa una, papansin nyo, kahit outside the Philippines as long as Philippine citizen or resident. Second, okay, has a link with the Philippines. Ano yung link na yon? May kontratang pinasok Pilipinas. O may central management dito sa Pilipinas. May branch agency dito sa Pilipinas, 'di ba? Dito, may business dito sa Pilipinas. Personal information was collected and held by an entity in the Philippines. So, lahat dapat may connect sa Philippines. So, pag wala kayong ma-connect, it is does not pertain to if the personal information does not pertain to Filipino citizen or resident. It has no established link in the Philippines, has no other links here in the Philippines, then extraterritorial application will not apply. Hopefully, I have made it clear. So, next slide tayo. Okay, we're going to talk about here now exceptions. Exceptions, okay. Exceptions ng ano? Exceptions na kung saan even if it is a personal information or it is a sensitive personal information, the provisions on Data Privacy Act will not apply, including the implementing rules and regulation. So, the first three, kung mapapansin po ninyo, okay, so let's read it first. First, information about any individual who is or was an officer or employee of a government institution that relates to the position or functions of the individual. So, information in relation to his government position. So, whether he is still currently working therein, retired, or resigned, okay, that information is still considered an exception. Okay. Basta take note that relates to the position or functions of an individual. So, pwedeng malaman dyan yung name ng position niya, salary grade niya, okay? Salary grade are usually disclosed. So, kung anong SG ka. So, SG 20, SG 19. So, your salary basically is really if you are in government is somehow is really disclosed. Okay, so next, information about an individual who is or was performing services under contract for a government institution that relates to the services performed. So you may not be really working in government, but you have contracts, transactions with the government. So, usually kapag yung mga contractor ng government, so with respect to, kunyari, magpapatayo ng mga roads, ng mga bridges, mga infrastructure projects, of course, may mga highest bidder dyan. And at the same time, kung sino yung mga highest bidder, they are required to disclose kung sino-sino yung uh, uh, mga may-ari nun. So, for public disclosure. So, and number three, information relating to any discretionary benefit of a financial nature, such as the granting of a license or permit given by the government to an individual. Okay. So, kung mapapansin po ninyo, the first three, okay, the first three are matters of public concern or interest. So, since they are matters of public concern or interest, certain information have to be disclosed to the general public because since this is a public concern, okay, you really cannot raise as a defense privacy. Okay? So that is the nature of the first three exceptions. So, medyo delete natin to para hindi maduming tignan. Next, okay, fourth, process for journalistic, artistic, literary, or research purposes. Okay, but of course, it has to be disclosed that such information, that such processing of personal information is for journalistic, artistic, literary, or research purposes. But not only disclose na that is for that purpose, it must really be intended for that purpose. So hindi mo pwedeng sabihin na you are processing certain personal information for journalistic, artistic, literary, or research purposes, and yet when yung when the actual processing was done, it was for other purposes. So not in accordance with what you have disclosed initially. So that would violate the rights of the data subjects. So fifth and sixth, parehas lang halos yan. So information necessary in order to carry out the functions of public authorities. Or sa sixth, information necessary for banks and other financial institutions, okay, to comply with certain laws. Okay, so yung number five, in order for certain government agencies to perform their functions. Okay, so anong best example nga niyan? Yung AMLA. Okay, so AMLA. So how can AMLA perform its functions to ensure that no money laundering is being conducted here in the Philippines if certain information would not be divulged or disclosed to them, 'di ba? So how can the law mandated function of AMLA can be performed if it does not have the required information to perform anti-money laundering investigations, 'di ba? So that is number five. But take note, of course, the information must be limited to the information necessary, limited to the information necessary for AMLA to perform its functions. So, for example, hindi naman kailangan ng AMLA siguro kung ano yung gender mo or yung health records mo, 'di ba? So, walang kinalaman 'yun sa money laundering. So, those information, so itong exceptions na to is really scrutinized. So, it must be really really limited to the exceptions. So, it must be strictly construed. Yun ang ibig sabihin dito. Number six, so information necessary in order for certain industries to comply with laws. So, yun na nga, with the BSP, to comply with the mandate of the BSP, with the anti-money laundering law, and other applicable laws. Okay. And number seven, okay, number seven, personal information. So take note here, originally collected from residents of foreign jurisdictions in accordance with laws of those foreign jurisdictions. So, let me stop you there muna. Kung mapapansin nyo rito, kung tutuusin, di ba, na-discuss natin kanina extraterritorial jurisdictions, extraterritorial application of the DPA, dito kung mapapansin nyo, walang Philippine link at all. Okay? The collection pertains to foreign residents or citizens. Di ba? Foreign residents or citizens. Okay? In accordance with the laws of those foreign jurisdictions. Okay? So take note ha. Ang nakolekta, okay, originally collected. The personal information originally collected lang muna ha, from residents, okay, of foreign jurisdictions in accordance with the laws of those foreign jurisdictions. So walang Philippine link, okay? Walang Philippine link dito. Okay? Pero dito ang sabi, including any applicable data privacy laws which is being processed here in the Philippines. So even if i-process siya dito sa Pilipinas, okay, even if i-process siya dito sa Pilipinas, as long as na-meet mo na ito, yung sa taas, na it was originally collected from residents of foreign jurisdictions in accordance with the laws of those foreign jurisdictions. Okay? Even if the same is being processed here in the Philippines, that is considered an exception. So these are the 7 exceptions of the scope of data privacy law and the implementing rules and regulations. So you must memorize them because most probably anything outside the exceptions covered ng DPA. And the exceptions are strictly construed. And it must really be for the purpose of those exceptions. So kung outside of those exceptions, kahit somehow related, it must be resolved in favor of data privacy or right to privacy. Okay, next slide. Next, what are PIC's and or PIP's primary obligations? Okay, primary obligations. PIC, alam nyo na yan, and PIP's primary obligations. Okay, we go to the next slide. Okay, these are the primary obligations of PIP and PICs. Okay, so adhere to data privacy principles. So ano ba tong tatlong data privacy principles? Very important, must memorize them. First, transparency. Second, legitimate purpose. And third, proportionality. We'll talk about them more in depth in the next slides. Next obligation would be to uphold data subject rights. Okay, yung data subject rights. Okay, uphold the individual's rights with respect to data privacy. So, right to information, right to access, data portability, rectification, erasure or blocking, right to object, right to file a complaint, right to damages. Okay, and number 3, implement security measures. Okay, implement security measures to ensure no data breach. Okay, to ensure no data breach or to ensure that the data subject rights are protected. So there are 3 levels of security measures to be implemented by the PIPs or PICs: organizational, physical, and technical. Okay, so that's the overview of the primary obligations of PICs and PIPs. Let's now go to data privacy principles. Okay, general data privacy principles. Okay. So the first one is transparency. So transparency, there must be no surprises in how the data collected is being processed. No surprises in how the data collected is being processed. So because of that, the data subject must be aware of the nature, must be aware of the purpose and extent of processing of his or her personal information or data. So, to be aware, the data subject must be made aware of the risk and the safeguards involved, the identity of the PIC, of the personal information controller, the one who would be processing his personal information. And he or she must likewise be informed of his rights as a data subject and how these rights can be exercised. So, transparency. So, I'll discuss more of transparency as we go on. Next would be legitimate purpose. Legitimate purpose. Okay? It must be required by law and not contrary to public morals. Okay? The processing of information shall be compatible with a declared and specified purpose which must not be contrary to law, morals, or public policy. Okay, that is legitimate purpose. And number three, proportionality. Proportionality. Collect only what is needed and commensurate to the benefits. Okay, so the processing of information shall be adequate, shall be relevant, shall be suitable, shall be necessary, and not excessive in relation to a declared and specified purpose. Okay, so for example, para daw makautang ka, di ba? Baka usually pag nangungutang ka, may mga certain documents na hinihingi in order to establish what? In order to establish your credit rating or yung capacity to pay the debt. Of course, kailangan din malaman certain information about you, your name, your address, kung saan kanila padadalahan ng demand letter in case na hindi ka magbayad ng utang, and but most importantly, your capacity to pay. So, tatanong diyan kung may trabaho ka, saan ka nagtatrabaho, anong uh, range ng salary mo. So, usually, mga ganun ang kailangan mong hingin. Ngunit, kapag may mga tao na dahil nangungutang ka, nang hihingi na sa'yo ng medical certificate, ng birth certificate, 'di ba? Ng X-ray mo, 'di ba? Or kung ano-ano pang mga information na not related in establishing your capacity to pay, then that is no longer proportionate to the purpose na gusto mong ma-achieve. So, that is proportionality. So, ask only what is required to achieve the purpose. So, yun ang ibig sabihin ng proportionality. We go to the next slide. So, under transparency, yun lang. Ito na rin yung na-discuss ko kanina. Must be aware of the nature, purpose, and extent. So, alam mo dapat kung anong gagawin nila doon sa personal data mo. Okay? So, personal data mo. So, personal data mo, that can be considered, that is your asset. And just like on any other assets of a person, you want to know kung anong gagawin nila kung ipapahiram mo yung asset mo na yon, di ba? So, especially money, di ba? So, you want to know the risks and safeguards involved, o identity of the PIC, o kung sino man yung magpa-process nun, and the rights as data subject and how these rights can be exercised. Okay. Next. How is transparency shown. So, paano mo masasabi na naging transparent yung PIC, okay, sa data subject? Of course, the best thing dyan is the consent of the data subject. Kung may maipapakita ang PIC, okay, na consent, na nag-agree, okay, ang data subject for the collection and processing of his personal information, then that is an indication of compliance with the principle, data privacy principle of transparency. So the consent, of course, it must be freely given. It must be specific. Okay, specific na pertaining sa collection and processing of personal information niya yan. And informed indication of the will. Okay, informed indication of the will. Next, how is transparency shown? Transparency can be shown through the privacy policy of the PIC. Okay, privacy policy of the PIC. What is privacy policy? Okay, this is an internal statement. Okay, internal statement that governs an organization or entity's handling practices of personal information. So that is a privacy policy. It is an internal policy that is to be observed by everyone who is a member or an employee of the PIC. Okay, of the PIC. Okay, and next we have privacy notice. Privacy notice. Okay, it is a statement made to a data subject that describes how the organization collects, okay, uses, retains, and discloses personal information. It is directed to external stakeholders. So, yung kanina, okay, yung kanina, it is an internal statement. Yung ngayon naman, this is an for external. Okay, for external stakeholders. Okay. Now, so technically, privacy policy is internally focused. Internally focused. While privacy notice is externally facing. Okay, so externally facing, this is with respect to customers, the regulators, the NPC, and other stakeholders, what the organization does with personal information. So, yun ang pinagkaiba ng privacy policy and privacy notice. Okay. Mm, Now we go to the next slide. We're still going to continue to discuss about consent, but ngayon, ito naman ay mga alternatives to consent. But before we proceed with the alternatives, yung sa consent, uh, yung mga best evidence that there is consent is that there is a signature. Okay, that there must be a signature. Or yung mga kiniklik na icon or yung clicking or yung opt-in boxes. So clicking an icon or clicking the opt-in boxes, that is another manifestation of consent. Third, it can be through email confirmation. So through email confirmation that consent was given. So okay yan. Next, oral confirmation. Oral confirmation, so, medyo mahirap patunayan because it is oral unless there are witnesses na nandun din that can testify that indeed the data subject has given his oral confirmation. And Another one would can be videotape consent. Videotape consent. So, binidyo na record na nagko-consent siya doon sa ah, ah, pag-process ng kanyang personal information. So, merong rule dito na silence or inactivity does not constitute consent. So be careful with that, ha? So hindi ibig sabihin na naging silent yung data subject or because yung data subject has not responded to your question of whether or not he or she agrees for the processing of his or her personal information, it does not convert into consent over time. So be always remember that. So that's a continuation of our discussion on consent. So ngayon, dito sa slide na to, we're going to talk about the alternatives to consent. So kung walang consent, based do sa mga sinabi ko, na that there is no signature, there's no opt-in box, there's no email confirmation, no oral confirmation, no videotape consent, okay? Uh, Processing of personal information by the PIC or the PIP, if delegated, can still proceed in these circumstances, in these six circumstances. First, if there is an existing contract with the data subject, okay, contract with the individual, for example, there is a contract to supply goods or services, okay, or to fulfill your obligations under an employment contract. Okay. This also includes steps taken at the request before entering into a contract. So, best na example na naiisip ko rito is with respect sa pag umorder ka for delivery, 'di ba? O for sa Grab, 'di ba? So, you have a contract of what? Of sale, of purchase and sale. So, may bibiling ka at i-deliver naman ni rider. So there is an existing contract. What is that? Contract of purchase and sale. And sale. Okay? So certain information would have to be processed. So una, anong pangalan mo? Pangalawa, saan i-deliver? Oh, at pangatlo, magkano yung ibabayad mo? So even if walang sinabi na consent, na sinabi, oh, I consent for you to process my personal information, the contract of purchase and selling, okay, that can be used as a justification to process personal information. Why? Because how can the contract be fulfilled if the personal information would not be processed, would not be given to the store na sila magpe-prepare ng food and to the rider na magbibigay ng magde-deliver ng food to your doorsteps. So, another example, if you have an existing employment contract, 'di ba? So, if yung employer mo can use certain information, so magagamit yung SSS number mo, PhilHealth number mo, Pag-ibig number mo, including your TIN, in order to register you doon sa mga government agencies na yun. And the employee cannot raise as a defense. Oh, walang consent. Well, as an employee, you are mandated by law na be registered with those government agencies. So, contract with individual. Second, legal obligation. If you are required by law to process the data for a particular purpose. So, best example nga, yung obligation of banks to report to AMLA for suspicious transactions or for transactions above the threshold of 500,000 pesos. So, kailangan ng i-report yan. So, that's legal obligation. So, hindi kailangan ng consent dyan ng depositor bago sila i-report sa AMLA. No. Next, if it is involving vital interest, matter of life and health. So, ngayon, 'di ba mahalaga-mahalaga yung pag pumapasok ka ngayon ng mga establishments, may mga contact tracing. So, in this contact tracing, mahalaga siya in case na magkaroon ng mga positive doon sa lugar na yon at matitrace na isa ka sa mga nagbisita doon. So, the establishment would have to disclose to proper agencies, especially the DOH, kung sino-sino yung mga nandoon. So, the establishment would have to disclose certain personal information relating to you because it is a matter of life and health, vital interest. Next, in case of national emergency, public order and safety as prescribed by law. So, national emergency usually ngayon, pandemic or in case of yung parating na bagyo ngayon. So, in case na magkakaroon ng mga calamities, so in order to comply with the requirements of public order and safety. So, halos parehas na rin yan dito, di ba? So, halos parehas na rin yan dito. Next, constitutional or statutory mandate of public authorities. So, the AMLA, pagka-report ni bangko sa'yo, pagka-report ni bank kay AMLA, AMLA can likewise process that information. No, aalamin kung saan ka nakatira. 'Di ba? Aalamin yung mga bank accounts mo, ipapa-freeze yung mga bank accounts mo. Oh. So they have to process your personal information in order to comply with their constitutional or statutory mandate. So that's another alternative to consent. And lastly, a bit of a catch-all phrase na legitimate interest of the PIC or third parties. So this is frowned upon. So this must be construed very, very strictly in order for the right to privacy by the data subjects be protected. Okay, so hindi ko mabigat 'yan. So you really have to prove that even in the absence of consent of the data subject, you proceeded processing his or her personal information. So you must have a legitimate interest. So that is a bit of a catch-all phrase therein. So now we go to the next slide. Now, we proceed naman to alternatives to consent for processing of sensitive personal information. Yung kanina, personal information lang. Ngayon, this is sensitive personal information. So, halos parehas lang, especially with respect to existing laws and regulations, protection of life and health, and legal rights and interests, yung catch-all phrase ulit. So, let's just confine the discussion with the remaining two: public organizations and medical treatment. So, ano ba tong public organizations? So, this refers to processing done by non-stock, non-profit organizations, cooperatives, and the like, where processing is only confined and related to the bona fide members or bona fide members of these organizations or their associations. So, pag kayo ay mga naging CPAs na, so you become an automatic members of the Philippine Institute of Certified Public Accountants. So, PICPA. So, that is considered a public organization. So, for lawyers, we are all members of the Integrated Bar of the Philippines, so IBP. So if IBPs have certain functions, PICPA have certain functions that in order for them to perform those functions effectively, okay, they have to process certain sensitive personal information about you. Mm. Diba? So that is with respect to public organizations. And lastly, medical treatment. Okay, so when processing is carried out by a medical practitioner or a medical treatment institution and there is adequate level of protection of the SPI. So, syempre, ikaw magpapagamot ka, 'di ba? Kailangan malaman yung mga medical records mo, previous medical records mo. So, lalo na kung kailangan multiple doctors tatrabaho sa iyo, mag-perform the surgery or kailangan i-outsource ka or ilipat ka sa ibang ospital. So, yung sensitive personal information mo would likewise have to be processed doon sa lilipatan mong hospital in order to perform and conduct a successful medical treatment. So, yan, alternatives to consent for processing of sensitive personal information. Let's go to the next slide. Next, discuss na rin natin to kanina. It must be for a legitimate purpose. The processing of PI must be for a legitimate purpose. The processing of information shall be compatible with a declared and specified purpose which must not be contrary to law, morals, or public policy. And next slide, proportionality. So for proportionality, you know, the processing of information shall be adequate, relevant, suitable, necessary, not excessive in relation to a declared and specified purpose. So talagang dapat sakto lang yung kukuning or yung processing of information. Okay? Hindi po sobra. So, okay, so we've discussed all the data privacy principles. Okay, so we go now to the next topic. So we're going to discuss now rights of the data subject. Okay, so here we have 8: uh, right to information, right to be informed, right to object, right to access, right to correct, right to erase, right to damages, right to data portability, and right to file a complaint. For the following rights, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 8, this can all be found under Section 16 of the DPA. Uh, yung right to data portability, okay, right to data portability, this can be found under Article 18 or Section 18 rather. Section 18 of the DPA. Next, rights of data subject are transmissible just like any other rights. Okay. General rule, they are transmissible. So the lawful heirs and assigns of the data subject may invoke the rights of the data subject at any time after his or her death or when he or she is incapacitated or incapable of exercising his or her rights. So, general rule, rights of data subjects are transmissible. This can be found under section 17 of the DPA. And here, limitations on the transmissibility of the right and right to portability. We have here Section 19 of the DPA. The provisions on transmissibility of rights and the right to portability are not applicable in the following cases. Okay? If the personal data are used only for the needs of scientific and statistical research, or if the processing is for the purpose of investigations relative to criminal, admin, or tax liabilities of a data subject. Okay? The limitations on these rights shall only be to the minimum extent necessary to achieve the purpose of the research or investigation. So, we'll discuss more in depth pagdating sa mga susunod na slides, but let's discuss more about the rights of the data subject. So, let's discuss more thoroughly yung rights of data subject. So, please bear with me, medyo mahaba-haba ito. So, first, we have the right to be informed or right to information. So, this is under section 16A and B of the DPA. So, the data subject is entitled to be informed whether personal information pertaining to him or her shall be or are being or have been processed. So, may right siya na malaman kung ipaprocess na ba, na-process na yung kanyang personal information. At the same time, he has the right to be informed of the following. First, description of the personal information to be entered into the system. Second, the purpose. Kailangan. So, na-discuss natin yung kanina. It must be for a legitimate purpose. Third, the scope and method of the personal information processing. Fourth, sino-sino ba yung mga recipients or classes of recipients to whom the personal information will be disclosed. Kanino ito i-disclose ng PIC? Methods utilized for automated access if the same is allowed by the data subject and the extent to which such access is authorized. 6. The identity and contact details of the PIC or its representative, the PIP. Next, the period for which the information will be stored. So, kailangan gaano katagal na kailangang i-store yung personal information ng data subject. And, of course, kailangan informed din si data subject of the existence of their rights. Ano-ano ba yung mga rights na to? So, itong mga to, kailangang i-inform ni PIC si data subject of his rights. So, the right to be informed, right access, lodge a complaint, right to damages, etc., etc. So, that is with respect to right to be informed or right to information. Next, we have right to access. Right to access. Okay, that this is covered under 16C. Reasonable access to, upon demand, the following. Okay, he has the right to access the contents of his or her personal information that were processed, the sources from which personal information were obtained. Third, names and addresses of recipients of the personal information. Fourth, manner by which such data were processed. Fifth, reasons for the disclosure of the personal information to recipients. Sixth, information on automated processes where the data will or likely to be made as the sole basis for any decision significantly affecting or will affect the data subject. Seventh, date when his or her personal information concerning the data subject were last accessed and modified. And eight, the designation or name or identity and address of the personal information controller. So, dito sa right to access, there must be a demand. Ayan, no? Reasonable access upon demand, the following. So, you really have to demand this. So, kumbaga, yung sa una, yung right to be informed, it is really the obligation of the PIC to inform the data subject of those information, of those data, even without demand. Okay? But in here, pagdating sa right to access, if the data subject will not demand the information I've just enumerated, okay, there is no compelling reason for the PIC to disclose it unless, of course, there is the demand made by the data subject. So, kaya pinaghiwalay pa yan. Right to be informed and right to access those information. Magkaibang bagay yan. Although related, there's a difference. Konting-konti lang naman. Next. The next right would be the right to rectify or right to object and to correct. Yan, pagsamahin na natin yan. Right to object and right to correct. This right or these rights are covered under Section 16D. Okay? Nakalagay doon, the data subject has the right to dispute what? The inaccuracy or error in the personal information and have the personal information controller correct it immediately and accordingly. Okay. So you have the right to object, to dispute any inaccuracy or error in the personal information and have that personal and have the PIC correct it immediately. Okay, so magkasama na yan. So to object and to correct. Okay. So I suggest class you read in full section 16, 17, 18, and 19 of the Data Privacy Act. Napaka-importante yan. Okay. Next. Okay. We have the right to no, erasure. Okay. Right to erasure or blocking of personal information. So the data subject has the right to suspend, withdraw, or order the blocking, removal, or destruction of his or her personal information from the personal information controller's filing system upon discovery and substantial proof that the personal information are incomplete, outdated, false, unlawfully obtained, used for unauthorized purposes, or are no longer necessary for the purposes for which they were collected. Okay, in this case, the PIC may notify third parties who have previously received such process personal information para i-delete din nila yon sa kanilang filing system. So, right to erasure and blocking. Now, we have the right to damages. O, yung right to damages and right to file complaint, pagsamahin na lang natin yan. Of course, you need to lodge a complaint prior na makakolekta ka or you'll be entitled to damages. So, you need to file a complaint before you will be entitled to damages. So, the data subject has the right to be indemnified for any damages sustained due to such inaccurate, incomplete, outdated, false, unlawfully obtained, or unauthorized use of personal information. Yan. So, in case of data breach, okay, in case of data breach, or in case of, yun nga, unauthorized use of personal information, the data subject shall be entitled to damages. And the damages are malalakit, no? Hindi usually hundreds of thousands and millions of pesos yung mga cases na involved dito. But mostly, halos lahat, foreign cases. Okay. And next, we have data portability. Hindi ko nga alam bakit nahiwalay pa tong data portability because ito diniscuss under section 18. The rest, lahat, section 16. So, right to data portability. What is data portability? Okay, the data subject shall have the right where personal information is processed by electronic means and in a structured and commonly used format to obtain from the PIC a copy of data undergoing processing in an electronic or structured format, okay, which is commonly used and allows for further use by the data subject. So medyo malalim, 'di ba? Medyo technical pero parang right to access lang naman 'yan. You have the right to access it, but the PIC will give this to you in an electronic form or format, okay? So that you can use the same for other purposes. You can use it for further. So anong best example na may isip natin diyan for data portability? Or best na isip ko is with respect when you're asking for bank certifications. So when you're asking for an average daily balance of your bank account. So para magamit mo to for certain requirements. So for example, ikaw ay nag-car loan, 'di ba? Nag-loan ka sa bangko. Nag-loan ka sa bangko or sa isang financing company rather. Sa isang financing company na kung saan ikaw ay nag-car loan. At yung financing company na yon, in order to assess your capacity to pay, would request you to submit 3 months bank statements, di ba? Oh, and then, ikaw, pwede ka mag-request sa bank ng bank statements or bank certifications in order for you to comply with the requirements of the financing company. So, that is data portability. So, parang right to access siya, okay, right to access, but in data portability, kumbaga dahil portable nga siya, pwede pang magamit ng data subject for other purposes, for other transactions or other activities. Kaya nga portable, can be used somewhere else. Okay. So those are the rights of the data subjects. So kanina we've discussed uh, the obligations of the PICs. Okay. Now we're discussing the rights of the data subjects. Okay. Next is the non-applicability of the rights o yung diniscuss ko kanina, yung limitations on the transmissibility and the right to portability. Okay. So here section 19, yon. So section 19 provides that rights may not be invoked if the process personal information. Okay. So first, if it is used for scientific and statistical research. Okay. Used for scientific and statistical research plus, okay, no activities and decisions are carried regarding the data subject. Okay. It was used for scientific and statistical research plus no activities and decisions are carried regarding the data subject, okay, plus the personal information shall be held under strict confidentiality. So, ito, okay, so under Section 19, you cannot invoke the transmissibility of the rights to portability if it is used for scientific and statistical research, plus no activities and decisions are carried regarding the data subject, plus PI shall be held under strict confidentiality. Another limitation provided for under Section 19 is if the processing, okay, is for the purpose of investigations, okay, investigations relative to any criminal, administrative, or tax liabilities of a data subject. So take note, ha? The limitations on rights shall only be to the minimum extent necessary to achieve the purpose of the research or investigation. So take note, ha, pag mga exceptions, kapag ka mga limitations under DPA, it is really viewed to the minimum extent necessary lang to achieve the purpose of the exception or of the limitation. Next, security measures. Security measures. As na-discuss natin kanina dun sa mga obligations of PICs, is one of which is the implementation of security measures. So this is the discussion of that. First, the types of security measures. We have the mnemonic POT or POT. We have physical security measures. Second, organizational security measures. And the third one is technical security measures. So we implement these types of security measures in order to ensure confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the personal information collected by the PICs. Okay, so next, so here in security measures, for physical security measures, these are security measures which help prevent theft. Okay, help prevent theft. Okay, so and some examples in order to do that is that workstations, okay, must be secured. Okay, security locks at the entrance and the office where the data is stored, and biometrics verification such as fingerprint, eye, uh, yun, eye, yung sa retina, di ba? Meron yun, sa biometrics yan. Next would be organizational measures, organizational measures. That would be to appoint a DPO. What is a DPO? A data protection officer. So all companies, okay, covered by the DPO, the DPA are required to appoint at least one DPO. Okay, to conduct privacy impact assessment, training, and capacity building. So those are organizational security measures. And lastly, we have the technical security measures. Okay, implementation of ICTs. ICTs, information communication technology. Okay, so such as firewalls, encryption, passwords, etc. So in this security measure, it's prudent that you hire your own IT. Okay, Next, protection against ransomwares and malware. So, technical security measures. We'll go to the next slide. Okay, but before we go to the duties and responsibilities of PICs and PIPs with respect to the implementation of security measures, uh, I will enumerate some of the things that must be taken into consideration in determining the appropriate level of security. Of course, first one would be the nature of the personal data or personal information collected and processed. Second, what are the risks posed by the processing of the data? Third, size of the organization. Fourth, complexity of the organization's operations. Fifth, current data privacy best practices. And of course, lastly, the cost of security implementation. So, lalo na doon sa technical security measures, talagang mapapamahal ka dyan. So, so you have to consider this in determining the appropriate level of security na kailangan mong i-implement in ensuring that uh, that the personal information would remain confidential, would be still has its own integrity, and would still be available to proper users. Now, anong pinagkaiba ng security and privacy? So medyo related siya, 'di ba? May nagsabi nga dito na privacy is why we put curtains on our windows. Okay, privacy is why we put curtains on our windows, while security is why we put locks on our doors. So that is a visual explanation to differentiate privacy and security. But to be more precise, privacy refers to a situation where you or your data are free from being observed or disturbed by other people. Okay? You have control over who can access your data plays a big role here. If you want to have true privacy, you need to be able to control who can access your information. So security naman is related to protecting and keeping unwanted parties from accessing your information. So while privacy is more about keeping unwanted eyes off certain data, security is about keeping the information private after it has been collected. Okay. After it has been collected. So somehow medyo interrelated ang privacy and security. For me, in layman's terms, security, okay, security, ito yung mga ini-implement nating measures in order to achieve privacy. Okay, in order to achieve privacy. Okay, so that is in layman's term how I would put it. So now we go to the duties and responsibilities of PICs and PIPs in relation to implementation of the security measures TOP. So dito ang sabi, implement reasonable and appropriate TOP. Yan yung diniscuss natin kanina. Next, promptly notify the NPC in case of breach or security incident. Okay, so meron um, you have mandatory notification of breaches to the NPC. Next, ensure employees, agents, or representatives involved in the processing shall operate and hold the personal information under strict confidentiality. And next, the PIC must ensure that third parties processing personal information on its behalf, ang tinatawag nating PIP, shall also provide security measures. So, dyan papasok yung PIP. Okay, so the implementation of appropriate security measures not only lies with the PICs, but of course, syempre, dapat sa PIPs din because technically, they are just doing the same thing, processing personal information. So, that's it. We go to the next slide. So, this implement reasonable and appropriate TOP or POT pala, no? Or POT or TOP. Same lang. Okay, so physical measures, organizational measures, and technical measures. So, ito na yung na-discuss natin kanina. No need to repeat it. Next, dito tayo sa promptly notify the NPC in case of breach or security incident. So, ito, in general, so in case of data breach, okay, we have to make notification to the NPC. But not all breaches requires notification to the NPC. So we will be discussing that later on. So briefly, the notification shall include the nature of the breach or the incident. So malalaman natin yan, the nature of breaches can be a confidentiality breach, it can be an integrity breach, or it can be availability breach. The same time, pwede rin yung mga breaches na yon, the types of breach, it can be a mix. So it can be confidential and integrity breach at the same time. It can be integrity breach and availability breach at the same time. So one does not exclude the other dito. So what kind of personal information are involved? Is it a PI or an SPI, di ba? Next, measures done by PIC to reduce the harm and PIC's representatives and their details. So in case of update, so pwedeng sila yung kokontakin ng NPC. Next, here, we're to discuss subcontracting. Okay, subcontracting. Of course, alam na natin yan from PIC papunta kay PIP. So, this subcontracting, okay? So, instead na ang magpa-process ng personal information, si PIC, it would now be subcontracted to, delegated to PIP. So, but here are some principles. PIC remains responsible for ensuring proper safeguards are in place. Although required din maglagay ng security measures si PIP, but it is still the ultimate responsibility of PIC to ensure na walang mangyaring data breaches or that security measures are in place. So in case of breach, hindi si PIP ang mananagot kundi si PIC pa rin. Next, ensure that PIP comply with requirements of DPA and ensure confidentiality and integrity. So, since subcontracting lang yan talaga yan, okay, mas mabigat yung trabaho ni PIC because iba na yung nagpa-process ng personal information ni data subject and yet he is the one ultimately liable and responsible in ensuring compliance with DPA rules, with the implementing rules and regulations to ensure confidentiality and integrity. Now, there should be a contract between PIC and PIP. Okay, there must be a contract between the PIC and the PIP. Okay, you must likewise put therein the duration of contract between PIP and PICs, obligations and rights of the PICs, and the geographical location. So, next, ano yung mga nakalagay dapat dun sa contract of yung subcontracting from PIP, from PIC to PIP. So it must include that the PIP must process data only upon the documented instructions of the PIC. So the PIP cannot act on its own volition, okay, without the documented instructions of PIC. So everything must come from the PIC. Next, of course, as sabi rin natin kanina, it is not only the PIC who is required to implement security measures. Okay, PIPs are likewise mandated to implement security measures. Next, the PIP must not engage in any other subcontracting without prior instructions from PIC. So, possible kasi magkaroon ng conflict of interest because kung dalawang competitors, natin dalawang PIC who are competitors would engage the same PIP, okay, without the knowledge of either party or only one knows the uh, same yung PIP nila, then that is possible conflict of interest because any data or information may be obtained by the competitor to take advantage or to the detriment of the other competitor. So hindi po pwede yan na mag-engage ka into subcontracting without the prior instruction from the PIC. Okay, and next is delete or return to PIC at the end of the agreement. So you have to return or delete all personal information or return the same to the PIC after the termination of the subcontracting. Okay, next. So now we go to breach management. So breach management. So despite the security measures placed therein, it is still possible that breach of data breach might still occur. So the DPA likewise provided uh, in the provisions therein on what to do in case breach occurred. So first, what is security incident? Security incident is an event or occurrence that affects or tends to affect data protection. So take note ha, that affects or that tends to affect. Okay. Next, a security incident is an incident that compromises the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of personal data or information. So, take note, yung confidentiality, integrity, and availability, those are the types of breaches. Okay. So, that is security incident. So, now we go to data breach. Okay. Data breach is a security incident. Okay. So, data breach is a type of security incident which, okay, leads to accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure, or access of or unauthorized processing of personal data. Okay, so yeah, that is data breach. It compromises the confidentiality, the integrity, or availability of personal data or information. So, itong data breach na ito, in fact, itong mga binanggit dito, these are considered criminal acts, okay? And they are penalized also by the DPA with imprisonment and hefty fines. So mamaya, we will go there at makita nyo ang tataas ng fines. Hundreds of thousands to millions and millions of pesos. Okay, so again, we go to types of data breach. So we have the confidentiality breach, integrity breach, and availability breach. So ano-ano ba itong klaseng breach na ito? So confidentiality breach, due to the unauthorized disclosure of or access to personal information. So ibig sabihin, merong mga tao or entities who were able to see or access personal information of data subjects of which they are not authorized to do so. So there's a violation of the confidentiality of the personal information. So that's confidentiality breach. Integrity breach, due to alteration of personal information. There were unauthorized changes in the personal information which affects the integrity, the accuracy, the truthfulness of the personal information of the data subjects. And lastly, availability breach, due to loss, accidental, or unlawful destruction of personal information. It can no longer be retrieved by the data subject or by any other authorized persons to have or to persons na pwedeng maka-access doon sa personal information na yun. So that's availability breach. So as mentioned earlier, it can be a combination or all of them. In case of breach, it can be just confidentiality or integrity or availability breach. It can be a combination of both, or it can be combination of all the types of data breach. Next, how to handle breaches. Okay? Sabi dito, you must implement security incident management policy. Okay? A security incident management policy is implemented by the PIC or PIP for the purpose, okay, of managing security incidents including personal data breaches, including personal data breaches. So remember, all data breaches, okay, all data breaches are considered security incidents, okay, but not, okay, but not all security incidents are data breaches. So there may be security incidents which did not lead to data breach. So remember, a definition of security incident is that an event or occurrence that affects or tends to affect data protection. So even so pag security incident, even the fact that it tends to affect, okay, pwedeng may possibility na magkaroon ng data breach pero never hindi naman nangyari, that is already considered a security incident. It is only when there is an actual loss, destruction, or unauthorized processing or disclosure of personal information or data that such security incident will be considered data breaches. So hopefully we have clarified the same. Requirements para doon sa implementation of security incident management policy. So, every PIC or PIP should have policies and procedures for data breach response team. So the first time na mangyari yung data breach, there must be a response team na magkakandak, mag-assess ng impact ng data breach na nangyari na yon. Next, of course, there must be implementation of security measures and privacy policies. So, ito nga, yung POT, di ba? POT and the privacy policies. Ito yung diniscuss natin kanina vis-a-vis privacy notice, di ba? Privacy policies, this is internal focus. So, ito yung policy that is being implemented inside the PIC or the PIP. Okay. Next, implementation of an incident response procedure. Okay, so how does the company kapag may nangyari ng breach, what are the procedures to be undertaken? Okay, so dapat merong procedures outlined already and ready to be implemented. Next, mitigation of possible harm and other negative consequences of a data breach and compliance with the DPA and other protection data regulations. So those are the requirements to implement security incident management policy. So next, mandatory notification of the data breach to NPC. Mandatory. So there can be data breaches or security incidents na pwede mong i-report sa NPC if you want to, but those are just discretionary. But these are the times when notification is required by law. Okay, notification of data breach is mandatory when the personal information involves an SPI, sensitive personal information, or any other information that may be used to enable identity fraud or identity theft. Okay. Second, there is reason to believe that the information may have been acquired by an unauthorized person. Okay. There is reason to believe, ha? Kahit reason to believe lang. Hindi pa proven na acquired ng unauthorized person. Okay? And the unauthorized acquisition is likely to give rise to a real risk of serious harm to any affected data subject. So technically, medyo uh, subjective yung pag-classify, especially 2 and 3. So this is usually conducted by a DPO, by the data privacy officer of the PIP or by the PIC. So there is reason to believe and that is likely to give rise of real risk of serious harm to any affected data subject. So of course, it depends on the assessment by the data breach response team and by of course by the PIC itself. Okay. So, talking about breach notifications, what is subject to the notification requirements? So, na-discuss na natin to in the previous slide. Okay, who should notify the PIC? So, the PIC. So, even if the breach occurred, okay, doon sa PIP, as I've said earlier, it is still PIC who has the ultimate responsibility of ensuring and protecting personal information of the data subject. So, PIC talaga ang magno-notify. When should notification of the commission be done? Within 72 hours, okay, from knowledge of the personal data breach based on available information. Okay? So, this take note notification to the NPC of the data breach has within 72 hours. So, ilang ano yon? So, 3 days. That is 3 days. Okay. Next, when should data subjects or individuals affected by the breach be notified? So, yun din. So, yung una, notification sa NPC lang. Okay, but here, when should data subjects likewise be informed of the data breach? So, kailangan rin naman kasi silang ma-inform because it is their data or their personal information or personal data which is at risk. Diba? So, sabi rito, within 72 hours then from knowledge of the personal data breach, unless there is a reason to postpone or omit notification, of course with the approval of the commission or by the NPC. So very important, memorize this. Madali lang naman yan, guys. So next, what is the content or what are the contents of the notification? Okay, contents of the notification, either whether to the NPC or to the data subjects. First, nature of the breach. So, is it an availability breach? Is it a confidentiality breach? Or is it an integrity breach or combination of two or all of them? Next, the personal information or personal data involved in those breach. So, lalagay mo doon, ano ba yung at risk na nawala or unauthorized access, etc. Next, measures taken by the PIC to address the breach. Measures taken by the PIC to address the breach. Next, measures taken to reduce harm or consequences of breach. Okay. Next, representatives of PIC from whom the data subjects can inquire about the situation. So, kailangan may representative ang PIC na pwedeng kontakin ng data subjects. And what would be the assistance to be provided by the PIC to the data subjects? Okay, that's the contents of notification. Okay. Next, data sharing agreement or DSA. So what is data sharing agreement? Data sharing agreement is the disclosure or transfer to a third party of personal data or personal information under the control or custody of a PIC, personal information controller. Okay? So it means that the PIC who has the control of personal information of data subjects will share that personal information to third parties. Okay? So the disclosure or transfer may be done by a PIC or a PIP only upon the instructions of the PIC. Okay? So remember that. So data sharing agreement cannot be done by the PIP on its own. It must be upon the instructions of the PIC. It excludes the outsourcing, disclosure or transfer of personal data by PIC to PIP. So yung outsourcing na dinidiscuss natin kanina by the PIC to PIP, that is not data sharing agreement. So that is usually outsourcing agreement na tinatawag natin between PIC to PIP. Next slide. Data sharing agreement, okay? Contract, joint issuance, or any similar document that contains the terms and conditions of a data sharing arrangement between two or more parties. So as long as the main or the gist of that contract is that the PIC will share the personal information of data subjects to a third party excluding the PIP, okay, that is already considered data sharing agreement regardless of the name of that contract. So they may call it a memorandum of agreement or whatever. That contract would still fall as under data sharing agreement. Only PICs shall be made parties to a DSA. Okay? So therefore, yung DSA agreement is an agreement between PICs. Okay? So once a PIC shares personal information to the third party, that third party likewise becomes a PIC. Okay, because he now has control likewise of the personal information of data subjects. Okay, so data sharing agreement basically is an agreement between two or more PICs. Okay, so next, usual contents of a DSA of course, lalagay doon. Yung purpose niya, yung ultimate purpose niya would be the data sharing. Next, the identity of the PICs. Okay. Next, term or duration of the DSA, which may be renewed as long as the purpose of the agreement continues to exist. Term and its extensions shall not exceed 5 years. Okay, terms and its extension shall not exceed 5 years. So may life lang ang data sharing agreement. So it can be 1 year, 1 year, 1 year, as long as the total duration of the contract of the data sharing agreement, including its extensions, shall not exceed 5 years. Okay. Overview of the operational details of the sharing or transfer of personal data and the general descriptions of security measures. So that's the usual contents of a DSA. Of course, it can be included by other provisions or other agreements between the parties. So basically that is data sharing agreement. Next slide. Next, we'll discuss data protection officer or yung tinatawag nating DPO. So appointing a DPO is required by law. So if you are a PIC and a PIP, ang sabi ng batas natin is that you must appoint a DPO. Okay, you must appoint a DPO. So under the DPA, including its IRR, a PIC and PIPs shall designate an individual or individuals who are accountable for the organization's compliance with DPA, its IRRs, circulars, advisories, and other commission issuances. Next thing that you need to know about data protection officer is that appointment of a DPO is one of the 5 pillars of the NPC. 5 pillars of the NPC. So, what are those pillars by NPC? So first, yun nga, sinabi natin, number one, appointment of a data protection officer. Data protection officer. Okay. Second, conduct a privacy impact assessment. So that's the second pillar of compliance. Conduct a privacy impact assessment. Third one, to create a privacy management program. To create a privacy management program. Fourth, implement data privacy and security measures. Implement data privacy and security measures. And the fifth one, be ready in case of a data breach. Be ready in case of a data breach. So those are the 5 pillars of compliance. I no longer put it in the slide, so just put it in your notes. So would like to apologize pala. The DPO is not data privacy officer, ha. It's data protection officer. So I may have confused protection with privacy. So when you speak of DPO, it means data protection officer. Data protection officer. Of course, data protection officer is subject to NPC issuances, very basic. And yun, this is a requirement na you have to register your DPO. So the PICs and PIPs must submit the name of their appointed DPO. Okay? There is a deadline to register. So I'm not sure kung mukhang tapos na yung registration of the DPO. I'm not sure kung meron pang extensions niyan. Okay. Next. Okay, so with respect to data protection officer, we'll discuss the qualifications. Qualifications of a data privacy officer. First, The data privacy officer must have specialized knowledge and demonstrate reliability. So medyo broad ito. So hindi sinabi kung anong knowledge ito. Maybe of course with respect to privacy or data protection policies, but very broad. So hindi natin alam kung special knowledge as to what. And demonstrate reliability. So someone who is trusted by the PIC or the PIP. Next, expertise in relevant privacy or data protection policies and practices. So here, usually may mga kinakandak na trainings and seminars ang NPCs, okay, and including private entities where in order to increase the knowledge, okay, of DPOs or those who intend to become DPOs sa privacy or data protection policies and practices. Okay. Next, the DPO must have sufficient understanding of the processing operations being carried out by the PIC or the PIP. So, yung process na ginagawa ng PIC or PIP with respect to the personal information of the data subjects, the DPO must have sufficient understanding about it. So, understandable naman bakit kailangan yan. Because he is to become the data protection officer. Next, knowledge by the DPO of the sector or field or industry where the PIC or PIP belongs to. So, yun. So, knowledge of the DPO of the business, of the sector, industry of which the PIC or PIP belongs. So, additional requisites. So, must be independent, must have significant degree of autonomy, and DPO may perform other duties as long as it will not give rise to conflict of interest. Okay, DPO must be independent, must have a significant degree of autonomy. So medyo subjective din to, lalo na kung yung DPO is likewise merely an employee of the PIC or PIP. So we're not sure how can we assess the degree of autonomy that a DPO uh, exercises. Okay? And DPO may perform yun nga, other duties as long as it will not give rise to conflict of interest. Ang madalas na ina-appoint na DPO ay yung mga employees din naman ng PICs or PIPs who have their own respective works or functions. So, I'm not siguro baka lalo na sa mga malalaking companies, yung data privacy officer nila or data protection officer nila is talagang focus lang in uh, data protection policies and practices. But most of the time, lalo na yung mga small to medium firms, may mga other works yan, other functions. So aside from being a data protection officer. So but being a data protection officer, that this is a uh, an additional job sa lalo na kung may ibang ka pang work. So most of the time dapat increasean din ng mga sahod itong mga data protection officer who are likewise performing other functions in the company of the PIC or the PIP. Okay, so next we will tackle the duties of a DPO. Of course, to monitor compliance by the PIC or PIP with the DPA law, it's IRRs, okay, and the circulars, NPC circulars, advisories, and other commission issuances. So, ensure compliance. Second, ensure the conduct of the privacy impact assessment. So, privacy impact assessment. So, kailangan yan. Yung privacy impact assessment, in fact, may mga trainings pa yan na kung saan yung mga DPOs are being trained on how to create a privacy impact assessment. So this is not really easy to do. So lalo na kung yung mga companies na yung PICs or PIPs have complex data processing. So, yun. Next, advise the PIC or PIP regarding complaints and or exercise the rights of the data subjects. So, yun. So, you must give advice to PIC, PIPs regarding complaints and with respect to the exercise of the rights of the data subjects. So, eventually, at the end, to advise in order to comply with the law. Next, ensure the proper data breach and security management by the PIC or the PIP. So in case of data breach, so what is the proper response uh, to that breach and how to lessen the consequences of that to the PIC, PIP, and of course including the data subjects affected by the data breach. Next, inform and cultivate privacy and data protection awareness. So, inform and cultivate privacy and data protection awareness. So, kung ikaw ay DPO, of course, you must always remind your co-workers and the management to ensure that all their transactions with third persons, with data subjects, okay, are in line with the DPA, IRR, and the NPC issuances. Next, advocate for the review and or revision of policies, guidelines, projects, and or programs of the PIC or PIP. And here, ito, serve as contact person of the PIC or PIP in dealing with data subjects. So, sasakit ulo talaga rito ng mga DPOs, lalo na kung may data breach and you have to notify the data subjects of the breach. So, katakot-takot na complaints ang maririnig ng DPO, lalo na kung siya yung contact person talaga in case of data breach. Next, cooperate, coordinate, and seek NPC advice on matters relating to data privacy or security issues. So, baka pwede kayo makahingi ng mga legal opinion. So, in case na may mga queries kayo and may mga gray matters in which the law, IRR, are silent about, so much better before you proceed in effecting any policies in your company, okay, seek the NPC advice. And lastly, to perform other duties as may be assigned by the PIC or PIP regarding data privacy or protection and upholding the rights of the data subject. So in here, yung DPO talaga is somehow mahirap yung trabaho niya because he or she has to balance his work kasi under PIC, PIP siya. So somehow gusto niya maprotektahan yung company na pinagtatrabahuhan niya, and yet at the same time, he is mandated by law to uphold the rights of the data subjects. So, kung may mga nakikitang violations ang DPO na pinaperform ng PIC or PIP with respect to the rights of the data subjects, it is mandated by law for the DPO to call the attention of the PIC or PIP and to rectify the same in order to avoid security incident, data breaches. So, ayun. So, medyo mahirap talaga maging DPO. So, dapat talaga taasan ng mga sahod nitong mga DPO na ito. Next, with respect to accountability, he or she has the responsibility of complying with the laws. With complying with the laws remains with the PIC or PIP. So, although the data protection officer is the contact person by the PIC or by the PIP with respect to privacy and data compliances. Okay, it is still the main responsibility of PIC or PIP, not by the DPO. So DPO to ensure compliance lang naman dito. But nevertheless, the responsibility is not transferred to the DPO. It is still with the PIC or with the PIP. Okay, malfeasance, misfeasance, or nonfeasance, okay, of a DPO or COP may still be a ground for administrative, civil, or criminal liability. Class itong COP, tinatawag natin Compliance Officer for Privacy. So basically, parang DPO na rin yan. So, instances where a COP may be designated, ang sabi ng batas natin, in case of LGUs, government agencies, group of companies, including the private sector and other similar cases. So, DPO and COP, basically halos parehas na lang yan. So, let's not deal with the difference na with the DPO COP. It's not really that material. Okay. The position of a DPO can be a full-time uh, job, or it can be a contractual job. Okay, but in case it is contractual, the term or duration should not be less than 2 years. Okay, the position of a DPO can be a full-time, regular, or permanent, and at the same time it can be a contractual job, but the term or duration should not be less than 2 years. In case of a DPO in the government, it may be a career, or it may be a career position or an appointive position. Okay. In here, in this slide, we have the data life cycle. So data life cycle, first, the personal information has been created, and eventually it will be collected by the PICs, and the processing can be delegated, outsourced to the PIPs. Okay, the PICs or the PIPs, under the instructions of the PIC, can store and transmit the personal information. Then eventually it will be used and distributed. It will be retained. Then eventually, at the end of it, it will be disposed and destroyed until another creation of personal information or another collection will be done by the PICs. So this is the data life cycle. Okay, so very basic. Just remember the terms. So we're now here on our last slide. We're talking about the crimes under the DPA and their respective penalty. So kanina dun sa discussion ko, nabanggit ko na the DPA includes criminal acts, and of course, because they are considered criminal acts, there is a jail term corresponding to those criminal acts. So, and look at the fines. Sobrang tataas. Mababa na yung 100,000 pesos. But the fine can go as high as to 5 million pesos. So, let's enumerate the same one by one. First, there was access due to negligence. So, there was unauthorized access due to the negligence of the PICs or the PIPs. So the jail term, 1 year to 3 years, 3 years to 6 years, 500,000 pesos to 4 million pesos. Of course, yung PICs or PIPs can be juridical persons, but with respect to the jail term, it will be, of course, the person na directly responsible for for those punishable acts. So kung juridical persons, of course, they can be fined, but since it is a juridical person, it cannot be imprisoned. Of course, pwedeng ma-revoke yung license nila, but nevertheless, the jail term will have to be served by the person directly involved or including those indirectly involved kung mapapatunayan that there was negligence on their part. Next, unauthorized processing of personal information by data subjects. So, hindi authorized yung pag-process na yun. So, for example, the PIP, okay, process the personal information of data subjects without the instructions of the PIC or not in accordance with the instructions of the PIC. So that is considered unauthorized processing, 500,000 pesos to 4 million pesos. Unauthorized purposes, so it is not one of those purposes disclosed to the data subjects at the start. Di ba yung transparency natin? The PIC must be transparent with respect to the purpose for which the personal information will be processed. So, kailangan i-disclose yan, yung reason why it will be processed. Eh, ginamit siya for other purposes. So, for example, it will be for a research purposes lang. And eventually, ginamit siya for another purpose, for profit. Then that's unauthorized purpose. So, 18 months to 5 years, 2 years to 7 years, 500,000 pesos to 2 million pesos. Improper disposal. So the personal information was improperly disposed or it should not have yet been disposed at pero dinisposed na. That's improper disposal. 6 months to 2 years, 3 years to 6 years, 100,000 pesos to 1 million pesos. Intentional breach. Intentional breach. So 1 year to 3 years, 500,000 pesos to 2 million pesos. Next, concealing a breach. Yung na-discuss natin kanina, in case of data breach, at pasok siya doon sa mga, yung pasok yung requirements for mandatory notice to the NPC and the data subjects, and yet the PIC failed or did not notify the NPC, including the data subjects. That's concealing the breach. 18 months to 5 years, 500,000 pesos to 1 million pesos. Malicious disclosure. The disclosure was made in order to prejudice the data subjects or any other person. 18 months to 5 years, 500,000 to 1 million pesos. Next, unauthorized disclosure. Unauthorized disclosure. Okay. Maybe the PIC disclosed the data or the personal data or personal information to a third party wherein there is no data sharing agreement between the parties. So that is unauthorized disclosure. So that is 1 year to 3 years, 3 years to 5 years of imprisonment, 500,000 pesos to 2 million pesos. And in case of combination of those acts, okay, so pwedeng mangyari dyan, pwedeng nagkaroon ng intentional breach and at the same time the breach was concealed. Okay, pwede rin na yung disclosure was malicious and at the same time that disclosure is unauthorized. 'Di ba? So combination of any of those acts, 3 years to 6 years imprisonment and fine of 1 million pesos to 5 million pesos. So these are the crimes and penalties under the Data Privacy Act of 2012. So, class, that's it. That's this is the last slide, and if you hopefully may mga natutunan kayo somehow with respect to Data Privacy Act of 2012, and if you have any questions, uh, If you're in my class, of course, you can raise those questions to me. And if you have any, if you're not in my class, you can ask, of course, your respective professors. And I'm very sure they are more qualified to answer your question. So, that's it, guys. So, hopefully may natutunan kayo. And that's all. Thank you for listening and God bless.